Before we begin, there are two things I must share with you to give context to this video. First, I have never touched any Silent Hill product prior to this remake, and second, I have a pretty positive overall view of this game. I do, however, want to point out that it's entirely possible I would dislike or even hate this game if I was a longtime fan of the original. It's a strange predicament we find ourselves in these days. As I'm sure you know, the gaming industry and really the entertainment industry at large is obsessed with remakes at the moment. There seems to be a general lack of drive to build great new things, and there is perhaps a dwindling supply of genuine creative talent to fuel such a drive in the first place. Now, before I am assailed in the comments section, I want to point out that I am not trying to say that there are no good video games being made anymore. This is obviously not true. What I am saying is that the general level of creativity and quality in the AAA space is significantly lower than it was maybe 20 years ago. As video games have become a much bigger business over time, they have become more safe, less creative, and less interesting on average. So it's kind of a downward trend. And I think this should be clear to anyone that's paying attention. Anyway, this remake culture is beginning to promote a kind of revisionist history, where the fan base in many cases is starting to split, and the new games are beginning to overtake the old ones, right? I can't help but think how meaningless and redundant it all feels. Like, this is a pretty good game, but does it really need to exist? I'm not sure that it does. Now, the general consensus regarding this remake among both new and old players is generally quite positive. However, there is also an outspoken contingent of longtime Silent Hill fans that fucking despise this game. Personally, as something of a purist myself, I am deeply sympathetic to this point of view, regardless of my own feelings about this particular game. I'll elaborate on this a bit more towards the end of the video. Now, obviously, I'm not going to weigh in on the debate of which version is a better game, as of course I don't have anything of value to contribute to such a conversation. I will occasionally mention the original game and use it as a point of comparison for certain topics, but for the most part, I'll be reviewing this game outside the context of the Silent Hill franchise, because of course that is my experience of the game as a new player. So what is this game like? In typical survival horror fashion, the gameplay is kind of a split between combat with resource management and exploration with puzzle solving. So the general structure of the Silent Hill 2 remake is highly traditional for the genre, which I like. I think that most of the moving parts here fit together quite well. It looks good, it's mechanically sound, and it has an extremely compelling story and world. I was actually somewhat surprised to discover that the narrative component is as good as it is. Of course, this is not to say it's a perfect game. It's actually quite far from perfect for my taste, and I will give you my thoughts about certain elements of the game throughout this video, starting with the gameplay. The combat of Silent Hill 2 is a slow-paced and extremely simple combination of very basic melee action and shooting. Melee seems to be emphasized throughout much of the game as a way to motivate the player to conserve ammo. Your melee weapon is consistent and reliable, it does effective damage, and it doesn't break or need to be repaired or anything like that, so it remains a considerable advantage throughout the entire game. This differentiates the combat in Silent Hill from that of similar games such as Resident Evil, where you will often simply avoid enemies to save ammo. Silent Hill empowers the player much more through this melee option, such that it's really never necessary to avoid enemies for the purpose of ammo conservation. You can just kill them all, which is something I personally found agreeable. Just like every video game of the past 10 or 15 years that features third-person melee combat, there is an iframe dodge, and the invulnerability window is rather generous here. It's fairly easy to avoid taking damage in most situations if you play carefully. So you only have one attack button and a dodge, as well as a small selection of ranged weapons that you acquire very, very gradually throughout the course of this lengthy journey. In the vast majority of combat scenarios, I used a combination of melee and shooting to dispatch enemies, which the game seems to incentivize, as I just alluded to. For example, shooting an enemy 2 or 3 times in the same leg with the pistol will generally cause it to fall to its knees, and then you can follow up with a couple of melee attacks for the kill. Of course, this isn't always possible, it's not all cut and dry, and there is some variety in the encounters. When you start fighting enemies in greater numbers later in the game, sometimes you have to just lay waste to entire groups of them at once using gunfire alone. The pistol is going to be your go-to weapon in many situations, as ammo for it is abundant across the entire game. I tended to to be pretty stingy with ammunition for the other weapons. The shotgun is extremely effective up close, and later in the game you find a rifle that allows you to pick off enemies from afar with a single well-placed shot. Both of these weapons pack a serious punch, and it's generally worth trying to save their ammo for the right moments. I would say that even though it's not very difficult, the game still does manage to make the player feel disempowered. Even given the decidedly modern approach to things like camera and combat mechanics, it definitely still has the cadence of survival horror. Like, James is not particularly fast or agile, and careful, deliberate gameplay is often required, especially when battling multiple enemies at once. The creatures you fight in this game can be fairly good at catching you off guard, but at the same time, the pace of Silent Hill is quite slow, and the dodge mechanic is very effective. So really, it's incredibly easy to avoid death in almost any situation once you get a feel for the gameplay. In fact, throughout my entire playthrough, I never died in regular combat at all. I died a couple of times during boss fights, and that's it, maybe 5 total deaths for the whole game. I also was never really starved for resources at all. In most sections of the game, there is plenty of ammo to find if you look around carefully. I always had more than enough pistol ammo at all times, and I never once came close to running out of healing supplies. It's true that I was pretty exhaustive in my exploration and was conservative with my resources, but I killed basically every enemy that I came across in this game, and I was never in danger of running out of ammo. I think I may have been rewarded for my frugality a little too generously. The general difficulty level could have been a little bit higher. At the same time, this game is long, and intervals between saves can be quite lengthy as well. So I can see how it could have been a frustrating drag to have regular deaths in this game, right? So these design decisions are understandable. Still, I can't shake the feeling that it is just a little too easy. This is one of those modern combat systems where your melee attacks just kind of teleport to connect with the closest enemy, like it's Assassin's Creed or whatever. I typically do not like this kind of thing, and I tend to avoid games with similar mechanics. But it's not terrible in this context. Judging by footage of the original game, the new combat system does appear to be an improvement, at least visually, but I think they could have arrived at something a little better. The dodge mechanic feels sort of too powerful, and you really don't have to consider spacing or anything like that very much in this game. You pretty much just automatically will land the hit if you swing near an enemy. I kind of wish melee was a bit more freeform and required a little more precision, like a more traditional hitbox-based system could have been an improvement if they executed on it properly. Don't get me wrong, I do think the combat Bloober team went with for the remake is largely good enough, particularly for survival horror. You know, melee feels hard-hitting, it's visceral, it's weighty, the guns feel powerful with good feedback, targeting is smooth enough. There's a respectable level of polish as well, with really nice-looking animations, and the simplicity of it all doesn't bother me. I think simplicity is necessary for a game like this, and I don't think it's boring or anything. I don't want to overcomplicate it either. I just think a more traditional melee system could have helped cultivate a little more skill in the player, like it could have been just a bit more fun, and this would have also helped heighten the tension and threat of death a little more as well. The only reason any of this probably even occurred to me is because I had so much time to think about it. The game is long, and there really is way too much combat here. I literally killed hundreds of enemies by the end, which in my opinion is clearly excessive for a title like this. I'll also add here that the enemy variety is pretty poor for a game that requires so much fighting. If the progression of this journey was paced a bit more rapidly and it simply had less combat, I probably wouldn't have taken issue with any of this, as it does feel pretty good to play. These are really just problems of excess. Overall, the combat gameplay is solid, if perhaps slightly too repetitive and somewhat lacking in challenge. As I said before, death was a non-issue in this game. Despite this, Silent Hill is still effective at making you feel like the possibility of death is around every corner. So even though the actual threat of death was very low during the course of my playthrough, the perceived psychological threat of death was generally high, and as a consequence, I felt more or less consistently engaged throughout. The exploration and puzzle solving are also executed pretty well. The game features a highly detailed map that you will constantly refer to and rely on. It records most everything you do and the locations of every significant discovery you make along the way, constantly updating itself to make sure the player is made aware of every detail, such as what rooms you've already been to and which doors you've unlocked. I like this, and it goes a long way to mitigate any frustration that could arise in such a lengthy game. I can see this turning some people off, as it really makes the game game into a constant map checking fest, but personally it doesn't bother me given the slow pace of the gameplay, and I found it to be a good feature. The levels are smartly laid out, and the path through areas can be fairly intricate owing to how puzzles are arranged to gate progress. Most of the zones generally revolve around corridors and other enclosed spaces as opposed to more open ones, which is par for the course for survival horror and something I actually prefer in most kinds of games anyway, so no complaints there. In Silent Hill 2, the claustrophobic nature of the environments I think was paramount to create and sustain the type of atmosphere the game wants to cultivate. It has the typical sort of Metroidvania-esque design concept that you'll often find in similar games where the player will constantly come across areas that cannot be accessed until later after finding a key, solving a puzzle, or eventually discovering a different way in, which again is par for the course, but still executed well. The map makes navigation and puzzle solving much more straightforward than they could have been. Keeping track of the status of various puzzles throughout these intricate multi-level environments would have been a slog without such a comprehensive map system. The puzzles themselves are often fairly easy, but I found most of them satisfying to engage with nonetheless. The vast majority are the kind of thing that you naturally figure out just by walking around the levels and gradually piecing things together, though there were occasionally some that stumped me for a while and gave me a nice little ego boost when I solved them. There's a lot of discovering random items and then figuring out where they fit or if they need to be combined with other items to create something that will give you access to new areas, etc. Items you find will often initially have no apparent use. Some of them you will hang on to for a long while until you eventually discover how to implement them in solving a larger, more central puzzle that's kind of going on in the background. There's a lot of this kind of stuff. If you're the type of person who hates puzzles in video games, steer way clear of Silent Hill. The puzzles are relentless, and in fact, some of this stuff is needlessly complex, just requiring too many steps to get the solve. I've heard Bloober Team made this game much longer than the original was, and this feels quite clear to me, even as a person with no experience of that game. It seems like they must have made a lot of unnecessary additions to the structure of some of these puzzles, most likely to inflate playtime. I guess they really wanted people to get their $70 worth. And while I never really found this too frustrating, I didn't hate it or anything, the game definitely felt pretty bloated across the board for my taste. I think the game is dramatically too long. It took me almost 20 hours to beat Silent Hill 2, and while it's true I tend to progress quite ponderously through these types of slow-paced games, I'm checking every car for ammo, I also basically never died, and it never really took me that long to solve most of the puzzles, and yet the game still went on and on. Now, I didn't mind this too much while playing the game, as I was enjoying myself and I kind of didn't want it to end, but it did start to wear on me by the game's final act. At a certain point it's just really? There's really another step to this? It does grow somewhat tiresome. I also haven't felt any urge to jump into New Game Plus, which is kind of a bummer. It just feels like such an enormous undertaking to restart from the beginning that I'm not sure I really want to do it again anytime soon. If I personally made this game, it would have been way shorter and more immediately replayable. I probably would have aimed for maybe 12 hours on the high end for a first playthrough, something that could easily be completed within 5 hours or so for most players on New Game Plus. It's really just too long. The sheer length of the journey also had a somewhat negative effect on the story. Let me be clear, the narrative of this game had me totally absorbed from beginning to end. It's very strong. Every sparse cinematic had me glued to the screen. And I'm not trying to take anything away from that, but the game is so protracted that the actual story beats felt spread a little too thin. You'll often go for hours without any significant reveals or narrative progress, and I just think the whole of the experience would have been better served in a more condensed package. So by now it might feel like I'm kind of dunking on this game a little, and that's not necessarily my intent. This is definitely a worthwhile video game, and I think its intended experience comes through quite clearly. The game is scary. Just for clarity, I was playing the game in a dark room with blackout curtains sitting 5 feet away from a 55-inch OLED display, and the intended mood was highly effective in my experience. And I don't mean that it's so scary you're going to be constantly hesitating to progress, terrified to enter that next room. It's not like that. But I did find it to be pretty much relentlessly tense and creepy. Silent Hill traps you in these excessively dark, claustrophobic environments for literally hours on end, and these spaces are of course filled with things that want to kill you. At certain points the game is so dark that you can scarcely parse what is happening on screen, and all you've really got to help alleviate this situation is the worst flashlight ever devised in the history of video games. This thing sucks, and that is clearly by design to maintain a disorienting and what appears appears to be a highly calculated gameplay experience. Silent Hill 2 has a very high level of visual and auditory realism, and you can really feel your character's plight, right? You really feel the stress of being trapped in this nightmare world. You're wandering around in the dark, desperately trying to put all the pieces together so that you can finally escape, only to be crushed when you discover that your reward for escaping is to be imprisoned in an even darker and more treacherous place, where you will repeat the same process again. It is willfully oppressive and can be somewhat demoralizing at times, which I personally found to be rather appropriate for such a game, so it's a positive. It is definitely a little too repetitive, but overall I love the sheer commitment to just submerging the player in almost total hopeless darkness for very long periods of time. I really appreciate that they didn't shy away from doing this to the player. It feels necessary to the atmosphere they were trying to cultivate, and I think all this stuff was pretty successful. You know, I could feel my heartbeat accelerate when I would find myself confronted by a group of enemies or whatever. I think largely the gameplay and all the various atmospherics do come together to form a pretty satisfying horror experience. A quick note on the characters featured in this game. I personally really enjoyed all of them, as well as the narrative contributions of each one. I also found the acting to be strong across the board. The actor who played James really stands out to me. His performance comes off pretty detached, but not like completely so. He's really nailing a certain balance here that just makes sense for his character, in my opinion. The game has plenty of compelling scenes and character moments, and on the whole, this is one of the most successful elements of the game. However, the visual designs of some of these characters I found to be less satisfactory. There are, of course, various opinions about this topic, and as someone with no attachment to the original designs, I can still see quite clearly why there are detractors here. The new character designs are decidedly less appealing than I would expect based on the look of the originals. James, I think, escapes relatively unscathed here. He looks pretty similar to his original design, as do all of them more or less, but there does appear to have been an intention to make some of the characters less aesthetically appealing, maybe than they were originally meant to be. Angela, for example, I don't think was originally intended as an especially beautiful character, but in the remake, they gave her kind of an odd-looking face. Like, it looks a bit too round, but it's also simultaneously a little too masculine as well. I found it to be a strange and unnecessary choice, especially considering that the actress she was based on is more attractive than this character model would suggest. Maria's character design is perhaps the worst offender here for me personally. I don't find her to be ugly or anything like that, but I think it's obvious that the original intent was for her to be more attractive than she is in the remake. Like, even without considering the old design, the story itself makes it pretty clear that she's supposed to be a more physically idealized character than she actually ends up being in the game. They also gave Maria a new outfit that appears deliberately more conservative than her original attire, which I found highly unnecessary and, again, kind of contrary to the narrative purpose behind the character. Even Eddie's character design is unnecessarily ugly in my opinion. I get that he's supposed to be this fat kid with low self-esteem who has been constantly bullied throughout his life, and an argument could be made that the new design is actually emphasizing this aspect of his character even more so than the original did, but I can't help but feel they simply went too far. The people in charge really should have tried to keep the character designs as faithful to the originals as possible. I think this one decision might have helped garner Bloober Team a lot more goodwill from some of the more hardcore detractors of the remake. The uglification of characters, particularly female characters, has been common in video games lately, and I guess the developers of this remake wanted to hop on that bandwagon as well. This kind of stuff does tend to make me skeptical about what other things Bloober Team may have seen fit to alter that I'm simply not aware of as a new player. Like, it makes me start to feel a bit wary about their intentions. I must admit, as a new player, these are minor issues for me personally. Like, none of this came anywhere near ruining the characters for me or anything like that. Still, it definitely stands out as something worthy of critique. So I'm not going to try to explain the story here, but I will say that it's of an uncommonly personal nature. It's very different from what you typically get in a video game narrative, even for the genre. You know how Resident Evil typically gives off kind of a cheesy 80s movie sort of vibe, like it never quite takes itself totally seriously? Silent Hill is not like that at all. It is a much, much more serious and even kind of cerebral expression of horror. It's much more psychological, and the execution of most narrative elements is extremely strong. It's very easy to get wrapped up in it all, and the effects of this narrative and its world are omnipresent at all times during the game. As you're stumbling around in the dark and scavenging for resources, you will often notice that a lot of things don't seem to make sense. As just one vague tiny example of this, you'll often hear creepy noises, presumably made by otherworldly creatures, and yet they never seem to actually materialize. Ambiguity permeates every aspect of this game. I spent a lot of time wondering how much of this stuff is actually real, or if any of it is. Silent Hill has a uniquely disorienting effect on the player. The narrative experience this game provides, in my opinion, is highly distinctive in the landscape of gaming. Moreover, there were several moments and reveals that had a genuine emotional impact on me, which I tend to find really impressive in the rare instances where this actually happens during a video game. This is an intensely poignant narrative, which also features truly exceptional music that was arranged flawlessly across the game. There's all kinds of little surprises and great moments that I won't mention here. The story really needs to be experienced to be understood on any level. It's a highly compelling mystery that no doubt rewards deep consideration and multiple playthroughs. And even though I'm sure there's probably a lot of nuance that went over my head, I can tell you that the narrative experience of this game is among the very best I've had in a long time. If you're a lifelong, dedicated fan of the original, you will no doubt have a very different perspective from me. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of hardcore Silent Hill fans online that fucking hate this game. And again, I personally have a lot of respect for this point of view. I think that level of passion and even that level of negativity is a necessary countermeasure against the corporatized leviathan of modern gaming, particularly when it's now become so fashionable to constantly fuck around with everyone's favorite games from 20 years ago, right? Regardless of how much you may enjoy your favorite new remake, there must always be a contrarian. Someone has to be there to say, no, this sucks, do better. Passionate nerds like this were responsible for the creation of all the best video games ever made, and it's seems like the supply of these people may be running low. From my perspective, the game's main issues were its many excesses. They're just doing too much, right? A more condensed version of this game would have been a lot better, and it might have been better still, as more of a one-to-one recreation of the original. You know, something like the 2002 GameCube remake of Resident Evil. But anyway, regardless of how this game may compare to the original Silent Hill 2, it is much, much better than most of the AAA garbage that gets released these days. Of course, somewhat paradoxically, it is a direct product of the current day homogenizing philosophy of modern game design, but it's also heavily stripped back compared to most games these days. Despite what I view as its excessive length, they didn't attempt to shoehorn in any additional progression systems or crafting mechanics or any nonsense like that. The game was able to just rest in its simplicity and do what it needed to do. You know, Bloober Team simply allowed the story to breathe. They allowed it to exist without really any additional bullshit to muddy the waters. And as a result, I think the game is mostly a success. It is able to stand apart from the crowd of recent AAA games as a unique, intense, and emotionally gripping experience. So ultimately, yes, I did enjoy my time with this game. Despite the things I didn't like, it was undeniably compelling. In some sense, it is probably one of the best horror games I've ever played, but I also suspect that the bulk of the elements I enjoyed most were probably already present in the original. The Silent Hill 2 remake is a good game that I think would be worthwhile for most fans of the genre, but I also can't help but feel that maybe I should have just emulated the old game instead. Anyway, that's going to be it for this one. Please write things about Silent Hill in the comments section, and thank you for watching.